Good afternoon. My name is Tammy Michaels, and I'm here to walk you through the Part 3 budget schedules. Our first slide we'll discuss is the BS 6001 Program Budget Summary and Support. We'll begin by reviewing the Program Budget Summary and Support and looking at Part 1. Part 1 can be seen at the top of this slide. It displays your entitlement for each fund source and is a summary of the available funding. These amounts are populated based on your completion of your application designation form, or ADC. If you didn't apply for or are ineligible for funding sources, those columns will be grayed out, as you can see in this image here, and you will not be able to budget funds in those areas. If you selected apply on your own in your ADC, you will see the organization's planning amounts. However, if you're a fiscal agent, you'll see the fiscal agent's planning amount, plus the amount for your SSA members that have designated you as the fiscal agent. To view the list of members, click on the button in the top right-hand corner, the schedule tiled View List of SSA Members. The list can help you as a fiscal agent to identify who has not completed their ADC. So if you have a SSA member who has not applied, you can reach out to them to get them to come in, and then those funds can drop in once they've submitted their ADC. So that's why it's crucial for fiscal agents to complete their ADC as soon as possible, because then the SSA members can pull the fiscal agent from the drop-down list in their ADC. Before you begin budgeting funds, please double check to make sure that the fund sources applied for in the ADC are displayed. If they're not, please reach out to your negotiator right away. Before working further on the grant, we can get the ADC reopened for you and you can get that corrected. Next, we're going to look at the BS 6001 Part 2 schedule. So Part 2 serves as an overview of how your grant funds will be used. In Part 2, you will enter the dollar amount by class object codes for direct program cost, administrative cost, and indirect cost. These items must align with the organization's needs, campus improvement plan, and district improvement plan. Additionally, budgeted items must be allowable under the authorizing program statutes, regulations, rules, and guidelines. Funds are completely budgeted when the line total funds available minus total costs equals 0. So a few helpful things to remember when you're completing Part 2 is that all expenditures, including the amounts budgeted for items not requiring specific approval, must be budgeted within the appropriate class object code in order to be reimbursed by TEA. Then if you reap or transfer funds, as we discussed earlier, those funds will still populate under the original fund source, but you will budget them as you are using them under the program that they are being reaped or transferred to. And this is the only time that you complete the BS 6001. Once it's saved and completed with no errors, you will have access to the other supporting schedules. And then we're going to move on to the next slide and give Nellie Nino from the PAC team time to discuss the BS 6001. Maybe not. I don't think so.
No,
we changed
Tammy.
that. I'm sorry. We changed that. We updated that. I think I covered everything. Okay, let's go back one more. Apologies. We're going to move on to the BS 6101 payroll costs now that we have the program budget summary completed. This schedule would be pre-populated based on completing the program budget summary and support schedule that we just reviewed. And although the organization may not have funds budgeted in the BS 6001, you'll still need to open and save them to complete the application. And then I think I got ahead of myself here. Yes, let's talk about the parts 1 and 2 that we have up on the screen here. Again, if funds were budgeted, they will populate in the part 1 total payroll cost. In part 2, line 1, it's for the organization's administrative support staff. You will want to enter the number of positions for each fund source. And then you include all part-time and full-time positions to be charged to the grant. You'll want to use whole numbers regardless of whether the positions are full-time or part-time. And then you'll want to keep documentation locally in regard to time and effort. Now we're going to look at part B and C, and these are check boxes, and you don't have to list the number of positions. You'll want to indicate if the positions are for LEA or campus positions. As the applicant, you determine how to classify the positions as professional staff or paraprofessionals. It's all defined locally. And TEA does not make those distinctions because organizational codes for personnel and job descriptions are all unique for every district. And then we'll want to talk about payroll costs part 3 on the next schedule, as this is our most frequently negotiated item. First, we're going to look at part 3, line 1, and this is for school-wide personnel, and it applies to payroll costs for school-wide campuses. This checkbox for school-wide personnel covers all personnel at school-wide campuses. That includes paraprofessionals, professionals, or any staff member. You're not required to check staff under the LEA or campus positions in part 2 above, as the selection covers them all. Again, instructions are in the upper right-hand corner of the schedule. They provide detailed step-by-step guidance if needed. Next, we'll talk about part 3, line 2, and this is for extra duty pay. You'll want to check this box to indicate that some or all funds budgeted in payroll will be used for extra duty pay. These costs include pay beyond normal work hours for professional support or support professionals not indicated in part 1 as determined by local policy. Next, we'll move on to the 3rd and 4th lines. Oh, that jumped ahead again, sorry. 3rd and 4th lines of part 3. Let's talk about part 3, line 3, for substitutes, extra duty pay, and benefits. These are for public and charter school teachers, which aren't indicated above. You'll want to check this box to indicate that some or all of the funds budgeted in payroll will be used for substitute pay for positions not indicated in part 2. So substitute pay is not to exceed the amount determined by local district policy. Pay for substitute teachers is allowable only for public school and open enrollment school teachers. Substitute pay for private nonprofit school teachers is not allowable under any circumstances. And then here are a few allowable examples. You want to use it for replacing grant-funded teachers in the classroom who are absent. You can use it for allowing teachers to participate in grant-funded professional development activities, and or allowing teachers to participate in grant-funded planning activities. And then our final section in here is line 4 for stipends. You'll want to check this box to indicate that some or all of the funds budgeted in payroll will be used as stipends. And again, this is determined by local policy. And then the final step in payroll cost is to check the confirmation of payroll requirements box at the very bottom of the page. And this confirms compliance and assurances that positions are in alignment with the grant program. Next, we'll move on to the BS 6201 Professional and Contracted Services Schedule. Again, if funds were budgeted in the BS 6001, they will show up here and populated in the source of funds column. Again, if there are no funds populated, you'll just want to save the schedule and move on to the next one. Note that in this schedule, funds will automatically populate in the remaining costs that do not require specific approval line. This schedule is used to budget professional services, consulting services, and contracted services. Costs that require specific approval must be itemized. And to itemize these costs, there are two lines in part 1 of the schedule. The first line that requires specific approval is line 1 for rental or lease of buildings, space in buildings, or land. This does not include short-term rental of meeting space for a conference or workshop or training. It does include rent for office space for grant-funded staff member for the full grant period. The second line in which the document costs that require specific approval is line 2, professional and consulting services. If you are unsure if items require specific approval, please refer to the Budgeting Cost Guidance Handbook. And then note that if funds are itemized in lines 1 or 2, any funding amount remaining will automatically populate under the remaining costs that do not require specific approval. Now we're going to talk about remaining costs that do not require specific approval. These costs are listed in, again, we're going to reference that Budgeting Cost Guidance Handbook. Pages 10 through 11 are an excellent resource. And then you'll also want to look at your local policies and bid processes to help make this determination whether to budget in here or not. So examples of remaining 6,200 costs include test scoring, staff and student tuition, maintenance of equipment, and utilities. Again, if funds weren't budgeted in this schedule at all, just need to save it and complete it. We will not have a schedule, the BS 6300. There is not one because supplies and materials do not require specific approval. You will only budget supplies and materials in the BS 6001 program budget summary and support. And then something to note this year that your school system may see an increase in supplies and materials with the new Edgar rules, with an increase in capital outlay from 5,000 to 10,000. We may be seeing a lot more items in supplies and materials. Now we're going to move on to our next support schedule, which is the BS 6401, other operating costs. And then again, if funds were budgeted in the BS 6001 for other operating costs, these funds will automatically populate in the line remaining costs that do not require specific approval. And we will discuss remaining costs in this next slide. However, we're going to discuss itemized costs here. So we have items that require specific approval in lines 1 through 7. All activities requested to support the grant program must be allowed under the authorizing program statutes, regulations, rules, and align with the DIP or CIP. So activities budgeted in lines 1 through 7 require specific approval. But note that this process has changed, as the organization will keep the documentation locally and no longer submit these forms unless requested for auditing and monitoring purposes. There are justification forms available for out-of-state travel, educational field trips, and travel costs for officials. And you can find those forms in the link here, forms for prior approval, disclosure, and justification. Remember, you don't have to submit these forms as you did in the past. Just complete the forms and store them appropriately. Again, forms maintained locally must be provided to auditors and monitors upon request. Now we're going to move into the next slide to discuss 6,400 costs that do not require specific approval. And as you can see, I have it circled here to point it out. We want to keep in mind to identify if a cost does not require specific approval. We're going to reference that budgeting cost guidance handbook. Pages 13 and 14 are extremely handy in identifying if it does or does not require specific approval. Items that we frequently see budgeted and remaining costs are in-state travel for employees, publication and printing costs, and many other items. And this can cause some confusion with that in-state travel because there is a line for out-of-state travel. If you're new, you think, oh, there should be a line for in-state travel. However, there isn't one with this. It does belong in remaining 6,400 costs. Let's see. So our next schedule is debt services. The debt services schedule allow organizations to budget funds for 2 activities in the grant. These are subscription-based information technology arrangements, or SPIDAs, and debt services. SPIDAs are for leases that are greater than 12 months, and capital lease purchase must cover at least 2 grant periods. And then please note that we're frequently negotiating items in the SPIDA section as they are for only a 12-month period. Costs are only considered SPIDAs if they extend past that 12-month period. And we highly recommend reviewing the Universal Errata on SPIDAs released by TEA for further guidance. And you may find a link to the Universal Erratas under the Grant Opportunities page. Okay. In this slide, we're going to discuss part 1 of the SPIDAs. Subscriptions are for more than 12 months, as we mentioned, and less than 5 years. In line 1, enter the amount of the SPIDA being charged to the grant for the grant period only. In line 2, enter the amount charged in interest for the grant period only. And then we'll discuss the full lifespan of the SPIDA in part 2. So again, part 1 is for the grant period. And then let's look at our next slide. And then we're still going to be focusing on that part 1, but we're going to talk about capital lease liability cost here. Capital lease liabilities are usually a 2 to 3 year agreement where the purchase could not be completed in a single year, and the contract dates must include this current school year. Costs must align with the grant program, be allowable, and be addressed in the CNA and district assessment. For more guidance on these costs, please review the instructions in the upper right-hand corner of the schedule. Okay. I'm going to back up just a tiny bit. Somehow keep skipping over these. So we're going to talk about the capital lease liability in part 1 a little bit more. This is line 3, where we identify the capital lease principal being charged for the grant period only. And then in line 4, we do the capital lease interest being charged for the grant period only. Then in part 2, if there are funds budgeted for SPIDAs, we're jumping back and forth a little bit here, we'll budget the entire cost of the SPIDA under the description of that SPIDA, under subscription cost line, and then we'll complete the following in that area. Describe the SPIDA, and then state the fund source the item is being charged to, enter the entire subscription cost for the full length of the agreement, and then document the entire contract period. And then in part 3, we're jumping back to capital lease liability. If funds are budgeted for capital lease liability, we'll budget the entire cost of under the property value line and complete the following. We'll describe the property and document the fund source the item is being budgeted under. We'll enter the entire cost of the property for the full length of the agreement, and then we'll document the entire contract period. Now we'll move on to our final schedule, which is the capital outlay schedule. Excuse me. Okay, so as we mentioned earlier, with the increase of supplies and materials that we anticipate, we had discussed EDGAR has been updated to reflect the new capital outlay threshold of $10,000. So the EDGAR rule states that a single unit with a cost of $10,000 or more must be capitalized. However, if your organization has a more restrictive capitalization threshold, then you want to use the dollar amount that is more restrictive. Some districts have a capitalization level of only $500. So therefore, anything that is $500 or more per unit needs to be placed in the 6601. When budgeting, make sure your items are in alignment with your local and federal policies as to how you capitalize. Capitalized items should be identified at your local level for the campuses and eligible students documented on the CNA or DIP or DIP. And this is a reminder that unusual costs may require pre-authorization in writing, even if the application is improved and the district has received its NOGA. Negotiators won't return the grant to remove an item if it is for unusual cost. It's the organization's responsibility to submit the documentation to TEA and must request this in a timely manner before you submit the items. Okay, now that we have that overview completed, we'll go more into the details. If funds were budgeted for capital outlay in the BS 6001 program budget summary and support, these funds will automatically populate in Part 1, Line 3 for furniture, equipment, vehicles, or software cost for items in Part 2. If needed, the organization will need to move funds to itemized costs in Lines 1 for library, books, and media, and or into Line 2 for additions, improvement, modifications, or capital assets. Funds budgeted into these two lines will automatically be deducted from funds in Line 3. And now let's discuss Part 2 for furniture, equipment, vehicles, or software. If funds were budgeted for capital outlay and we're not using lines 1 and 2 as discussed, you will need to include a generic description of the equipment, the funding source, and the number of units. Also include a description of how it will be used to accomplish the goals of the program. So this is a very common negotiation that we send back to the districts. Oftentimes we're seeing brand names in these lines. We want to use a generic description. So we have an example of using iPad. Instead, we'd like to use a language tablet, because if you have a tablet and you're not buying the brand name iPad, it can be audit findings. So pay very close attention to how you describe it. And don't use the generic, or do use a generic name, not the brand name. So an example of a well-documented capitalized item for Title IV-A funds is vape detector equipment. And the purpose is to improve school conditions for student learning and maintain a safe and healthy environment. This language uses generic names, and it aligns the purchase by using allowable activity language pulled from the program guidelines.